afternoon. Let me join Karen in saying that I hope Natalie Winters becomes president, and let me say I hope she becomes the first female president of the United States. And I say that in a, of course, nonpartisan way. Did everybody watch the debate this week? Now, maybe it was my television, but, I was watching the TV, and I thought, this year we're going to elect a person of color as president because orange is a color. And let me just say, thank you, okay. Let me just say that I love Natalie. I think she's absolutely brilliant. So I'll say this not as a but. We're going to win. When I say we, I think the country's going to win this fall. And as we can get pretty depressed when we listen to Frank Gaffney and, Trevor Loudon. And I listen to them, and I always get both depressed and inspired. Because at the end of the day, we're Americans. And Americans have a way of rallying when things get tough. And I think that's where we are today. Things are tough. Let me say, I saw Joe Bast here. Hello, Joe. And Joe is one of the heroes of the conservative think tank movement. I haven't seen you in many years, Joe, but I just want to thank you for being here and thank you for all you've done for this country. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to talk mostly about China in my remarks today. I have the pleasure of serving as chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. But I also wanted to say a few words as sort of to lead in this whole idea of World War III. There was a World War I, we all know. It doesn't get much talk, right? They make the movies mostly about World War II. But there was a World War I, and how did it start? And it was, of course, people say the immediate cause of it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And we kind of just say, somehow think, oh, okay, well, that must have started it, and there was World War I. When in fact, World War I was started because Germany had ambitions. Fritz Fischer, in his famous book, German War Aims in the First World War, lays all this out. But he basically makes the argument that the German people, the German government, the Kaiser, had ideas about how Europe ought to be organized. And they made plans to conquer Europe and to organize it to their liking. That's why there was a World War I. And France and the United States had to stop them, and other allies too. So World War I ends in October of 1918. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were not allowed to rearm, or only under certain very limited circumstances. That's in October of 1918. When did the Germans start rearming? November of 1918. They started front companies in Switzerland because their ambitions in World War I were not realized. And they were not going to be told what to do. They had made agreements. They had lost World War I. But they were determined, because they were a determined people, to reorganize and to build a military in order to conquer Europe. 1923, there's a little-known treaty called the Treaty of Rapallo. In the Treaty of Rapallo, the Soviet Union signs a treaty with the Germans that allows the Germans to train their military on Soviet soil. And you're thinking, why would the communists do that? Why would they help the Germans, which had been so provocative, in starting World War I and in all the millions of people who died in World War I? Why would the Soviets help them rearm and remilitarize? Because the Soviets knew that the German war aims had been frustrated and that war was going to come again in Europe. And that if war was going to come, it would be good to know what the Germans were going to do. And so allowing the Germans on Russian soil, Soviet soil, was a way of understanding that the war was going to come, and they were going to be prepared as well. It's what great nations do if they want to organize the world to their liking. It's not about personalities. If Adolf Hitler would have never been born, those German ambitions would still have existed. Their desire to militarize would still have existed. The political track they would have taken may have been different. Hitler put them on one kind of track, but the war was going to come. Winston Churchill, seeing all this, went around England in the 1930s, and he started a group called The Focus, and he would talk to groups smaller than this, a few tables over there sized groups. He would do it all the time because he saw, and his colleagues in England saw, that the Germans rearming, what the Russians were doing, what the Americans were not doing, was going to be a problem. And so he tried to explain to his countrymen and to the Americans that when the war came, bad things would happen if they weren't adequately prepared. Again, that's politics. So when we're here in this room with you today, talking about World War III, we want you to understand this, but we want you to be able to tell your friends and your neighbors and your families to understand this, because the war's already started. At the Committee on the Present Danger of China, we're fond of saying that the Chinese declared a people's war in May of 2019. They declared the people's war because the United States, they said, had greed, and they were trying to stop the ambition of the Chinese people. When in fact, what was really happening was the Trump administration said there's no more theft of intellectual property. That's going to stop. When the Trump administration says that, they declare the people's war. And they declare it only partly for our benefit, but mostly for the benefit of their own people. They were trying to tell their own people, you're going to have to sacrifice because things may get kind of sporty here. So they were conditioning everyone that the war had happened. However quickly it would take, or however long it would take, the war was going to happen. Now, you heard a lot of theory this morning, let me just say, about international relations. I don't have a theory. I don't believe in theories. I believe in America and what does it take to defend America. That's not a theory. That's just a principle that we have to operate under at all times. I went to a fancy college in Southern California as an undergraduate, and we had a professor of international relations there. His name was Harold Rood. He was a private in Patton's Army in World War II. He was a very learned man, had gone to Stanford and Berkeley, and was a very accomplished scholar. But I once asked him, have you ever read this or that philosophical work? He said, not a word of it. He would have a course on, it was called Strategy and Diplomacy. And the first day of class, he'd come in with a M1 carbine. And he'd take it, he'd hold it, show it to everybody, he'd break it all down, put it all back together, he'd set it on the desk. And he'd say, that's diplomacy. The rest of the course, we're going to talk about strategy, the use of military power, and what's required to defend ourselves as free people. In a course on international relations, I say this partly because it's just how we have to think of these things. Everyone in the class was given a task of a lecture they were going to have to give at some point in the semester. And people would have to give a lecture on something in the Civil War or World War I, World War II, what have you. You can imagine what these things would be like. And then one kid had the task of explaining how to fix the differential on a Jeep. And he, the kid got it. He said, my parents, he said, are spending a lot of money to send me to the school, and I'm going to give a lecture on how to fix a differential on a Jeep? What's that all about? And he said, look, it's a very practical world. And you might find yourself in Europe sometime with a bunch of Nazis chasing your ass. And when that happens and the Jeep breaks, it might be a very useful thing to know how to fix it. Because all the theories in the world go out the window when people are shooting at you. So anyway, when I'm thinking about all these things, it's in that very practical sense, okay? There's nothing theoretical about what I'm gonna have to tell you. You know you're in a war. We almost don't even need to say that to you. My concern is really something Natalie touched on, and that's this election. Communist China is a great nation. They have 1.4 billion people. I fear we underestimate them much the way we underestimated the Japanese before World War II. We think that all they care about is money, because all we care about sometimes is money. So we think they make all this stuff, they're selling it to us, they're investing, we're investing in them. This must all just be about money. When in fact what the Chinese care about is power. And they care about being the most powerful nation on earth. They think of themselves as the master race of this earth. Xi Jinping, who is a devotee of Mao, said that there can be but one sun in the sky, meaning them, not us. So whatever he's going to do is to make them the most powerful nation on earth. They spend $16 billion a year annually in the United States in intelligence and influence operations. 16 billion. That's a lot of money. That's annually. Think about how they would spend that. They hire up the best law firms in the country, either directly or through their businesses. They hire the best PR firms. They hire the best, communications firms of all types. And so when they buy those up, especially the law firms, if you're an American with a business and you need to hire a law firm to defend you against some Chinese malfeasance, that law firm is now conflicted. They can't help you because China is a client, or one of the big Chinese corporations is a client. And so if you're an American or an American business, you're out of luck. That's influence. $16 billion, they spread it through the universities. They create front charities that do a lot of the giving. And so people in universities see a benefit to being, if not pro-Chinese, neutral on China. They spread it through chambers of commerces. They spread it through political donations that they launder through a variety of sources. They have the Confucius Institutes that we know about on college campuses. They have 300,000 plus students in American universities. Some of them are paying tuition. The graduate students are not paying tuition. They're stealing still 500 billion with a B intellectual property a year in this country. So spending 16 billion is a pretty good investment on their part to have that kind of influence. You spread money, as I say, politically. You hire the president's son, President Biden. And you tell Hunter Biden, your dad says you're the smartest guy he ever met. We would love to have you work with us on a multitude of business deals, financial, investment funds, because you're obviously a smart guy. And he thinks, gosh, I am a really smart guy. And he gets paid millions, not billions, millions. And all of a sudden, the Biden family has a huge interest in making the Chinese happy, or any one of a number of countries that do this kind of dance with American politicians. The world is looking at us today, and they see that our elites are extremely corrupt. Not the American people. I'm a believer in the American people, or I wouldn't be here. None of us would be here. The American people are a good people. That's why Donald Trump is such a danger. Again, in a nonpartisan way, I'm just observing politically that Donald Trump is someone who taps in to the desire of the American people to live as free, prosperous human beings. And for that, the American left goes crazy, the Chinese go crazy, the globalists, more broadly, see Donald Trump as a threat that must be taken down. 2020, I believe, was a stolen election. I was one of those people who investigated it on behalf of the White House in November and December. I went to Arizona and Nevada. And I believed pretty quickly when I was there that the election had been stolen, but I had a team of people working on this. I had 500 pages of documents that we had assembled, and I had written to the White House that even though I believed it was stolen, we were not going to prove this. You're not going to prove this unless you have the power of the federal government to do it. And of course, we know the President and the Justice Department under Bill Barr did not, Bill Barr, not the President, but Bill Barr did not lift a finger to go do that. And the election was stolen. About 2 years ago, I'm at an event similar to this, and my wife texts me. She goes, "The FBI's at the front door." And I said, "Open the door." Because if they have a warrant, they're going to kick in the door, and I'm traveling, and so we're going to need a new door. So just open the door. And they were serving me a subpoena, of course. And I testified before the grand jury, the January 6th grand jury, partly because on January 6th, I was co-hosting the War Room with Steve Bannon. I only got subpoenaed. They put him in jail. But I explained to the grand jury exactly how I thought the election was stolen. And it mostly involves fake ballots. It could be the machines. We don't know if it's the machines or not. But certainly the ballots. I did say about the machines, and again, in America, you don't really have a First Amendment right to talk about voting machines, even though all of us are going to vote on a variation of those machines in 52 days. But around America, and all of you and me in 52 days will vote on a machine using software that was designed in Venezuela, licensed to the various companies that are, Dominion, Hart, InterCivic, ES&S, Smartmatic. Smartmatic is the one who owns the software. We'll be voting on that machine that was developed in Venezuela, a communist country that is the sworn enemy of the United States. We're going to vote using their software, which on its face is just ludicrous. It could be perfectly fair, but how much faith will you have in a system that is running software that is made in Venezuela? Apparently these are jobs, doing software, apparently these are jobs Americans just won't do. We have to outsource this to Venezuela. Now, just on its face, it's crazy. That is how crazy our voting system is today. That should be an embarrassment for our republic. I wrote a long piece for the Claremont Institute, where I used to be the president, where I talk about how I'm concerned that Communist China could have a hand in doing this. Communist China, with their 16 billion, could have just a small fraction of that, and they could, in warehouses in the swing states, produce fake ballots. This is a nation state with the capacity of a nation state. They have printers, obviously. They make them, right? They have computers. They have artificial intelligence. They have quantum computers. With artificial intelligence, they can acquire, and even less than artificial intelligence, they can acquire the ballots, the voter rolls. With artificial intelligence, they can acquire the signatures. They could produce, because they have access to the voter rolls, they could produce 1 million ballots, to exaggerate the point, in any of the swing states, fill them out for their preferred candidate, and then the task then would be to get them into the system. If they did it by mail, that would be one method. If they did it by Dropbox, that would be a different method. But you don't need to have the machines manipulate anything if you can simply produce the ballots. We have affidavits from 2020 of a driver from New York bringing ballots into Pennsylvania. That seems to go sort of, is just kind of an anomaly, when in fact it looks like maybe that's how they stole the election. Once you have mail-in ballots this way, used in such a prevalent way, you have a lot of trouble having a free and fair election. Once you have very little chain of custody within the system, let's say you have no mail-in ballots, but you have very poor chain of custody, and you can turn in a ballot, or look, people have been trying to rig elections since the first election. We're human beings, we do these things. The ability to steal an election is there. We've not built a system that is safe and secure. The old way we used to do it in America, let me just say, is we had paper ballots, you showed your ID, and they were counted by human beings with other human beings watching them. That's not that complicated. Most of the world does that, as Natalie was saying. If you're not going to get back to that, you're not going to have a stable republic. We don't have one today. Frank made the point that the other side's not 10 feet tall. That's absolutely true, which is why I think President Trump is going to win. And I say that as an observation, not as advocating anything here. And I think so because Kamala Harris is not a very good candidate. She's ill-prepared. She appears ill-prepared. She's not a real candidate in so many ways. We all saw what appears to be a coup to replace Joe Biden with Kamala Harris. We watched the debate. She's not a very believable person. That aside, President Trump speaks to the American people in an important way. He puts their interests first. And again, whether you like President Trump or not, that resonates with the American people in ways that no other presidential candidate in my life has ever done. Will he win? He should win if one looks at the internal polling in a fair election. The betting markets think so, analysts think so, What will happen if he doesn't win, however? If he's winning in all the polls and it's absolutely clear to most people he's going to win, if they then steal it, what will happen to the country? You're going to have a circumstance where you'll have an ungovernable country. Again, not advocating an ungovernable country. But people will decide state by state that we're not going to comply with what Washington has to say. We're going to nullify those laws. We're not going to acknowledge the authority of the federal government. We'll be a divided people. If she is president and the American left overreaches to somehow tyrannize the American people in ways large or small, you will have this ungovernable country. No one would benefit from that more than the Chinese and our enemies in Iran or Russia or anywhere else in the world that does not seek to have the United States in the position it's in. I am encouraged, as I said at the very beginning, because they're not 10 feet tall. This whole thing really is about, in conclusion, the freedom of the mind. Anybody who's sitting in this room got into all this because they believe in the freedom of the mind, that they could live as a free human being, that they could think what they want to think, that no one was going to tell them what to do because we're Americans. And we have fought and died for human freedom. We did it before, we'll do it again. We pray that it's with ballots and not bullets ever in this country. But the challenge before us is to rally our countrymen to this cause, to have them realize freedom can be lost. I am firmly of the belief that America is the last best hope on earth. If we explain that to our friends and family and have them rally to the great cause for which this country has stood, all will be well. If not, God help us. Thank you.